Hi, and welcome to the MMB book launch of Natasha Carver's brilliant book, Marriage, Gender and Refugee Migration. I've been looking forward to this so much. It's going to be really great, really fun, and it's a fantastic book. So we're very honoured to be able to launch it, and we've got a great panel set up. So first, of course, we've got Dr. Natasha Carver, who's a lecturer in criminology at University of Bristol. So thank you very much, Natasha. We've got Professor Katharine Charsley, who's Professor of Migration Studies at SPACE, the School of Sociology, also at Bristol. We've got Huda Jama, who is an 18-year-old aspiring poet, but actually seems like quite a pretty good poet already to me, who is a Black Muslim Bristolian and who's just finished doing her A-levels and is looking to go on to study creative writing. So welcome, Huda. Unfortunately, we were hoping that Kaltun was going to be able to join us, but she's had an emergency because she works in a lab and she's got to escort some bigwig around the lab just at the moment when she wanted to be with us. But we're very fortunate because she's agreed to, she's kindly recorded some of the readings from her own work, her own poetry, and also from Natasha's book. So welcome everybody. And I'm going to hand over to Natasha for the first words.
Thank you, Bridget. So thank you everyone for coming. I want to start just by saying thank you. Thank you to Bridget and Emily for organising this event. It's wonderful and fantastic. It's a real shame that we can't actually be all together in person. I had kind of envisaged, you know, a nice hall with lots of nice copies of the book and people milling around, but I'm grateful that we can do it on Zoom, and it has allowed a lot of you to join who wouldn't otherwise be able to join, so that's really great. I'd also like to thank Katharine and Kaltun and Huda for taking part. I really appreciate you guys being here. It's fantastic. And I'd also like just to spend a bit of time saying some other thank yous, which are really important to me. Katharine Charsley and Esther Dermott were my supervisors through my PhD. Esther unfortunately can't be here today, but they were fantastic supervisors. I could not have asked for better supervisors, and it is definitely as a part of their excellent supervision that I have been able to reach the point of publishing a book. So thank you very much, Katharine and Esther. There are many other academics to whom I'm indebted, Bridget, of course, being one of them, and several of you are here today, or more than several of you here today. I can't name you all, but thank you so much for coming, and thank you for all your support through the years. And I'd also like to thank my funders, the ESRC for my PhD and the Journal of Law and Society for my postdoc, which of course was crucial in being able to complete the book. There are lots and lots of friends who've supported me on this journey. Again, thank you to all of you. I'd just like to say, to mention two friends in particular who very sadly died during the course of writing this book, Hannah Ahmed and Lindsay Chaplin. They were both inspirational women who I am hugely indebted to for sort of teaching me an awful lot about life and also contributed in many ways to the formation of this book. But my biggest thanks of all goes to my participants. People gave up their time and shared their stories with me, and that was such a privilege. Doing an ethnography is perhaps one of the most privileged experiences anyone can have, and I would recommend everyone to do one if you ever get the opportunity. I spent 18 months hanging around people, pestering people, interviewing people. There were 44 interview participants. Most of those were migrants themselves. I think all of them, in fact, were migrants themselves. And most of those were of the parent generation, or what I'm calling a parent generation. And it would be really wonderful if I could thank them all by name, but they gave their stories anonymously and on those conditions of anonymity. So I can't do that. But sometimes that makes it seem like, you know, this is all me, the book is all about me, this event is about me. But of course, the book is co-produced to the extent that it's built on the stories that people shared with me. And although those individuals can't speak at this event, and that's why it's even more fantastic that Kaltun and Huda are both able to participate, both being very much of the younger generation than myself and my participants. So I'd like to start by getting Emily to put on the screen one of Kaltun's poems called Let's Learn, and let's just listen to Kaltun reading that.
You had a life I can only capture glimpses of. From your descriptive tales to your accurate accounts in a language that is more yours than mine. I know you always say what is yours is mine, but truth is, my stories are not the same. Understand that we may have differences in accounts and those accounts in different languages. I'm struggling to catch more of a glimpse of yours and maintain my own. So be patient. Let us both learn from this new land we are in.
Thank you. I mean, that's a beautiful poem, which my understanding of it was on one level, to me, it's about a daughter speaking to a parent, saying, you know, I can only capture glimpses of your life, and especially speaking to a migrant parent, perhaps a daughter who's grown up in the UK or the West, trying to understand these stories that the parent is telling them about another world, another language, another culture that they are part of, that, you know, what's yours is mine. But the truth is that my stories are not the same. And I think that this poem on another level also really speaks to me about the process of doing ethnography. And that's why I really wanted to bring it in today, because as a sociologist, as an ethnographer, you know, we can only ever capture glimpses of other lives. And, you know, we get these descriptive tales, we get these accurate accounts, but it's always in a language that is not our own. And what we do is we take those stories and we put them into our own language. And so the truth is that our stories, you know, are not the same. There's one set of truth in the stories that I was told, and I've taken those and I've put them together and I formed my truth, if you like, of what I heard. And so I would ask all my participants to, I'm saying thank you to you. You know, it was an amazing experience, but also please be patient with me and let us both learn from this new land, which is kind of the land of ethnography in the book that we're in. So yeah, so I just want to kind of say that. And now I'd actually like to go on and talk a little bit about the book. And I want to start with a fragment of a poem, which Kaltun has also recorded. So we'll just listen to that now.
In here, everything is questioned. Everything is changed. Everything is upside down.
So for me, this poem really speaks to what is the sort of starting point of the book. When we think about refugees, we normally think of loss. We think, you know, about loss of life, loss of family, loss of friends, loss of possessions and houses and things like that. But what this participant is talking about here is a loss of ontological security. And that's something we think about a lot less. A loss of knowing sort of who you are and how you fit into the society around you. What is expected of you as a man or a woman or a husband or a wife or a married person or a child, all the conceivable roles that might be found in any and every culture. I would explain it to myself like that every culture has a kind of vast toolbox from which each person can use to sort of shape and adjust and their life course and present themselves and their identity to the world. And in doing so, they kind of leave their imprint on each tool. But in the refugee experience, the toolbox suddenly becomes useless. You pick up what you thought was a hammer, something solid and heavy, and find it's sort of bendy and ineffective for banging in nails. And you pick up a needle and thread and find that it fails to stitch items together in a way that you're accustomed. And so if we take that metaphor, we can say you use the strategy that has always been used to sort out small problems in maybe your marriage, or big problems, or to discipline your children, for example, but you find that these strategies have no traction, they don't work, they're ineffective. So the ways and means of your life, your very being, are altered through the process of refugee migration. And this loss is felt most keenly within the family. Husbands no longer know how to be husbands, wives don't know how to be wives. And so what the book attempts to document is the process by which new roles, new notions of gender roles, particularly husband, wife, man, woman, take shape in the new location. And I do that primarily through narrative analysis, which is to say, analysis of the stories told to me by participants. And in those, there were public-facing stories, or fables, even atrocity stories, which operate almost like sort of urban myths, which tell kind of worst-case scenarios in which marriages end in very messy divorces. But I was also told personal and private accounts of relationship breakdown, which, unlike the atrocity stories, are steeped in emotion. So I also looked as well at the stories men and women tell about everyday life. Who does the dishes? Who should be doing the dishes? Who doesn't do the dishes enough? And all the kinds of arguments that happen within a family, as well as the good moments too, the kind of the doing of family. And with that, I'm now going to hand over to Katharine to speak a little bit. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Natasha.
Sorry, just before Katharine starts, can I ask, just say to people, could you put your questions, any questions you have as we're going along, in the Q&A? And if you would rather put your questions directly to Natasha or Katharine or Huda, could you just let us know, and we can facilitate that. Yeah, sorry, Katharine.
Thank you. That's okay. I see there's already a question in the Q&A, and it's quite a fundamental one, so I wonder whether we should address that before we start. So somebody asking about the term gender, which is quite fundamental. I guess I understand by gender so if we think about male and female as to do with biological sex, gender is to do with people's social identities as men or women or other gendered identities. Is that a reasonable summary, Natasha?
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, we expect different things of men and women. We expect them to behave in different ways. And each society has its own expectations of what makes a kind of a good man or a good woman. And so those expectations are often when we talk about gender, that's kind of really what we're talking about, those kind of society expectations that aren't sort of innate to biology, but just what society expects and of you know, what a man is or what a woman is.
I thought that was quite a fundamental question. So anyway, but going back to talk about the book, I'm actually going to start off by talking about Natasha, because I first met Natasha when she was an immigration advisor, but she was considering the idea of doing a PhD, drawing on her professional experience. And I'm very glad that she did, because I had the great pleasure of seeing the project develop and Natasha designing it, getting funding for it, and then pursuing it with remarkable research and writing skills. So it's a great pleasure to see it arrive at this point, published as this beautiful book. Congratulations, Natasha. And the book's a really remarkable piece of work. It takes as its main focus spousal relationships, so marriages and their challenges and sometimes endings, or as her participants described it, the divorce problem. But Natasha uses this as a perspective for a really wide-ranging discussion of gender norms, of experiences, aspirations, and discourses. So marriage might seem like a really narrow focus, but the chapters of the book cover issues from, well, employment, responsibility, money, remittances, to childcare, refugee migration, transnational families, and FGM. And what we get in the book is very far from the stereotypical representations of Muslim gender relations, which really plague British political and media discourses. So rather than seeing gendered practices as a matter of cultures adapting or failing to adapt to Western gender norms, Natasha uses her participants' narratives about men and women and marriage, together with useful background on Somali history and politics, and on the British and indeed the Bristol context, to construct a far more nuanced portrayal, a more complicated portrayal of ideas around gender. And she shows these as emerging from histories of nomadism and conflict, of refugee migration and diaspora, and the constraints and opportunities of transnationalism, but also of encounters with different models of gender roles in multicultural Britain, and religious discourses that have both local and global kind of characteristics. So although the book Natasha starts with a couple of stereotypes of Bristolian Somali gender stereotypes of men neglecting obligations in favor of chewing khat. Have I got the pronunciation of khat there right? And women as freedom junkies, rejecting their marriages when they discover the autonomy afforded by the welfare state. But by the end of the book, it's clear that Bristolian Somali women and men are engaged in much more complicated negotiations of appropriate gender and marital relationships. And a really distinctive thing about the book, which you've seen already in the little poem excerpt, is the form in which quotations from the participants are given. So rather than straight transcription, just typing up the words in standard paragraphs, and that's most common in ethnographic work, but it can mean that readers focus on how speakers of English as a second language might diverge from standard grammatical forms or vocabulary. So standard transcription can make it look like there's a lack of fluency, even if that's not at all how the conversations were experienced. So instead, what Natasha's done is she's used technical transcription, but also formatting the participants' quotations as a kind of poetry to evoke the distinctive cadence of their speech. And I think that's really successful for two reasons. So one, it celebrates the poetic and communicative skill of the participants, something which I understand from the book is also in keeping with the traditions of Somali language and oratory style. But it also allows Natasha to develop her analysis of narratives in a lot of detail, exploring them not, as she says, just for the meaning of the stories, but for the work that they do. And this is a kind of approach which is both creative and meticulous, which I think marks out this poetic ethnography from the conventional norm. And indeed, Natasha's own writing is itself highly skilled and at times poetic, as she's already shown today in the introduction to the book that she's given. There was a bit that I particularly relished, which maybe illustrates this, when she's talking about the morality tales of the cat chewer and the freedom junkie. She talks about them as respectively petrifying and awful. And that's lovely, playful, but also analytic use of language, because the cat chewer in these representations is both a frightening prospect, but also it's a stereotype as being stuck or frozen in some kind of idea of Somali traditional masculinity. And so petrifying is just the right word there, where the freedom junkie both inspires awe for her boldness and a bit of horror. So awful. It's really clever stuff. Anyway, Natasha draws on what could be a bewildering array of literatures to support her analysis. I don't know how she's had time for the volume of reading that she's done over the course of the last few years, but the skillfulness of her writing means that it remains accessible. And basically the book's a really good read. So if you haven't read it yet, I very much recommend it. So where do I see the main academic contributions of this book? Well, obviously to the study of Somali diaspora, but I'll single out three other contributions. So first, to the study of gender and Islam. There's a lovely nuanced exploration of Somali women using drawing on Islamic discourses to support arguments for changes to power relationships within families. And this is something that's familiar from other British Muslim contexts, but she does it so really nicely. She shows that what looks at one level like religious conservatism, wearing the hijab or abaya, exists alongside using Islamic arguments for changes to cultural practice and gender ideologies, and the active debating of these in a multicultural context and with Muslim friends from other ethnic groups as well. There are also really important contributions around masculinity and migration, and that's a field which has only recently got into its stride in the last decade or two. And one of the really strong themes in that literature, in that research, has been how migration can present challenges to masculine status. So migration can mean downward mobility, de-skilling in the labour market, maybe domestic authority of the breadwinner kind of undermined, and perhaps women's access to welfare, also altering domestic gender kind of arrangements. And from that perspective, various kinds of migrant men's actions have often been portrayed as an attempt to recoup some of that lost status. But in this book, we get a more subtle argument. So that the crisis of masculinity that some of the Somali participants described means a re-evaluation of what signals successful adult masculine status. So those atrocity stories that Natasha mentioned, there are those who cling to nostalgic indicators of Somali masculinity, of inappropriately levels of cat-chewing or taking a second wife back home. And those are presented as inappropriate to the British context, as well as taking on new meanings in this context. So chewing cat at the time of day when it arrives fresh in the UK is presented as disrupting family life in ways in which it wouldn't necessarily in the daily rhythms in Somalia. But then at the other end of the scale, the aspirational figure of the modern nomad, successfully seeking new ways to support his family through transnational mobility and business, well, that's obviously not accessible to all men. But many of the men in the book narrate themselves as successful masculine in terms of masculine status in another way, as supporters of dependents overseas and engaged fathers to children here, with those roles having new significance as markers of men taking on appropriate masculine responsibilities. So it takes what's been a kind of central issue in the study of masculinity and migration and gives it lovely more nuance and detail. And more generally, the book adds to our understandings of how gender roles and relationships are renegotiated in the context of refugee migration and transnationalism. And it demonstrates the key role that discourses about marriage play in that renegotiation, and that these are live, active debates. So I'll finish off and pass over to Huda, who's going to read a poem from a participant in the book, with one woman talking about why she thought her marriage hadn't worked out.
So I'm reading this poem by Huda on why marriage didn't work. He was a nice guy as a person, and still, you know, we are related. We don't talk to each other before, but he's my extended family. But you know, and then I'm this person, independent, strong-willed. I believe what I'm doing is right. Then I'm not standing for anyone, you know. And then he was expecting something else. Maybe he was expecting, you know, the typical Somali mother, you know, who stays at home, cooks for the family and cares for the husband. But I'm not that type of person. I have never done my dinner at 12 onions. It's always late in the evening, you know. I've always gone to courses or help people or go to work or come back later after school. So nothing worked. Cool. So that poem had, I think it links quite well into what Natasha's book is about, because it really highlights how a lot of Somali women feel, especially in this new age, where we grow up and we have new responsibilities. We want to provide for ourselves rather than be provided for, you know? And a lot of men don't, or Somali men traditionally don't say agree with that or expect that in a woman, or more specifically in a wife. I wrote about misogynoir, which is the discrimination against Black women specifically. So I wrote, as a young Somali girl in the UK, and the issues that I face and that I'm sure not a lot of other Somali girls face growing up in the Western world, there was a quote that inspired this poem. Malcolm X said, "The most disrespected person in America is the Black woman. The most unprotected person in America is the Black woman. The most neglected person in America is the Black woman." And I think as Black women ourselves, a lot of Black women watching this, you may relate. Okay, so the poem's called "From Me, an Angry Black Woman, to You." As their faces twist in my presence, their fingers point at my brown, her blackness, our identity, the curls and coils that sprout and bloom from the horizon of my head, seen as a threat, as they cower and flee to safety, away from my brown, her blackness, our identity, molding us into villains, into the antagonistic, undesirable woman. While I've always had nothing, they take away my everything. Oh, tell me why their words are so sharp and vicious. I weep as they carve me with scars of struggle and yearning, scars of heartache and woe. I crave love and affection, a portion of appreciation, and an acknowledgement that I am a woman, entitled to warmth, entitled to an abundance of worthiness. And while I have all, they take away my everything. I dream of a little sunshine in my life, an embrace from the man I gave a piece of my heart, an embrace from the world that break women like me down into a million pieces, that cuts and parries, even as I fracture in the very palms of their hands. Time and time again, my dreams on repeat, fantasizing about a world that offers me love in abundance. While I've always been given nothing, they take away my everything. It's that intense stare again. It wears me down and beats me to a pulp. The stare of judgment and disapproval shreds the little confidence I hold on to for dear life into frail, minuscule pieces of shame. The stare of my brothers and co-workers breaks and shatters my ego. And while I have always been told to be nothing, they take away my everything. My heart breaks for the child within me. She lives in a vicious cycle of confusion and self-loathing, for her ambitions defer to her peers, as she cherishes chemicals, damaging her precious curls and ethereal skin, blinded to her own beauty. She disguises herself as the girl she sees in magazines, aspiring to be fair, desperately clasping onto the beauty standard designed to ruin her. And while she changed to be something, they took away her everything. They point their fingers at my femininity. They play a potter as they shape my womanhood into a mold of foolishness and shame. My face may be the blueprint for strength and empowerment, yet they fail to see I am breaking down because of that god-awful stare they dagger towards my hair, my body, my skin. They bellow and cry mockingly at my daughters and their nieces, and while we have always known nothing, they take away our everything. I'm told to be less critical, told to be less hating, told to alter my complexion, the angry black woman, the laughing stock, the worn-out joke, and while I have always known nothing and have always had nothing, they still take away my everything. Thank you. That was all.
Wow,
Thank you so much, Huda. That was such a powerful poem.
Thank you.
yeah, really powerful. They really have taken away your voice, Huda. That's really, really powerful. Thank you so much for sharing that with us.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
What I really like about Huda's poem is the way that it brings out how not just prejudice and racism, but how we all experience things intersectionally. And I think that's a really important part, and that's why it relates quite well to the book, because you know, as a Somali woman is a really different experience to being a Somali man, and as a Muslim woman is really different experience to being a Muslim man in the UK. And part of that's obviously because about, you know, dress and how obvious it is that you're a Muslim, for example, but also that's about, you know, stereotypes that both cultures have with regards to women and their role in society. But those stereotypes are kind of overlapping, but also different. And that's something that I talk about in the book a little bit about, you know, how, you know, so differences between men and women in one culture and can be considered negatively. So one of the participants gave me at the outset, gave me a little book of proverbs that she'd been given when she got married. So it was like a wedding gift. Her brother gave it to her, and it was full of proverbs, hundreds and hundreds of proverbs about marriage, all about marriage. So some of those were about what men think about women, and some of those were things like what men say to women, and they were generally pretty sort of you know, misogynistic and stereotypical. And but this participant who had the booklet, she was, you know, she read them and she was like, this is the truth, this is how men are, this is how women are, you'll find the truth here. And I gave this booklet to another Somali friend who you know, kind of looked through it, and she was just like, oh, this is just so old-fashioned, it's not. So even within you know, within our own cultures, we have really different opinions of what men should be and what women should be. And I guess that comes back to that first question about, you know, what constitutes gender, what constitutes a man, what constitutes a woman, what performances of femininity and masculinity do we expect and do we want to see, and what performances are kind of reviled and degraded, and that, you know, really intersects, as Huda's poem drew out nicely, with color of skin and with racialized ideas as well.
Thanks, Natasha. We've got some great questions in the Q&A, which I'm going. So because we're recording this, I'm going to actually speak the questions, because otherwise we have to get permissions from everybody, and it all gets horribly complicated. So what we're going to do is I'm going to put the questions to you, and then if there are people that want to ask the questions themselves, we'll leave some space at the end when we'll stop recording, and then people can come forward and ask their questions. Okay, so so at the moment we're still recording, and I've got a question first from Natalie, who says, could you say more about how gender roles were reinforced or disrupted by the migration process, and what role does religion play?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Natalie. So, yeah, gender roles were really disrupted. I think Katharine touched on this a bit, particularly for men, because men in Somalia were accustomed to being the breadwinners and accustomed to supporting the family and having very public lives. And when they come to the UK, especially as refugees, they are put into a legal category which doesn't give them much leeway to perform that same role. So it's really hard as a refugee to settle quickly in the UK and get a job, because you're on a sort of temporary visa for 5 years. You have restrictions operating against you when you first come in and seek asylum, and often that process can be really extensive, like employment restrictions. So even if you do have the language and sort of transferable skills in terms of you have the qualifications that are recognized, then it still can be really an uphill struggle to get the equivalent kind of job as to what you were expecting or had in Somalia. But they're not, for most people, you know, Somali school leaver certificate, for example, is not recognized in the UK. So some of the people I met had finished school, got their school certificate, and then had come here and had to start again with GCSEs followed by A-levels, even though they were adults, because there was no way of showing that they were suitably qualified to get into the job market. So that journey is immensely disempowering for men. But for women, there was a more subtle kind of change. Obviously, some women that affected too, because they were also sort of had jobs in Somalia, and a lot of women did have jobs in Somalia, but their jobs weren't perhaps quite so publicly recognized in the sense of qualifications and kind of professions, perhaps, if you like. And those women found it really hard to, reproduce Somali family life in the UK, because they explained to me that Somali family life in Somalia is very lived communally, you know, so the children can run around outside, they can play outside all day long, and everyone's a parent, you know, everyone's looking out for your kid, everyone's checking where people are. There's a lot of support, so you can easily leave your children if you need to go to the shop or whatever you need to do. Whereas in the UK, our lives are very private. So we're closed, we're stuck behind doors, we're in high-rise flats. It's cold, you know, so we don't spend most of the time outside. And the relationships, the family relationship, the spousal relationship gets a lot of pressure as a result, because you're kind of confined into a very small space, just the sort of two parents and the kids. So that changes gender roles as well. So I hope that answers some of the first question. And then talking about the role that religion plays, I found that religion played a really important role, especially for women. So women spoke to me a lot about how Muslim identity had become more prominent for them than a Somali identity following migration. So for example, they spoke about how they'd always been Muslim, but in Somalia, it's easy to be Muslim without really thinking about it. Whereas in the UK, they had to actively think about what it meant to be a Muslim. They had to seek out halal food. They had to seek out ways of praying and being together. And that meant that they gained a new knowledge of their religion, and they used that knowledge very proactively to challenge sort of cultural norms that they weren't happy with, but also to forge friendships and different sort of community groups with other Muslims in the country. So yeah, religion plays a really important role.
Thanks, Natasha. So I think that I hope that has also answered Khalid's question. So Khalid says, congratulations for the publication of the book. And he too asks about religion and how the book can contribute towards the Somali perspective around questions of gender and gender sensitivity. Pretty big question. I mean, do you feel that you do contribute the Somali perspective, or, you know, as a non-Somali person, like?
Yeah, I mean, I can't possibly speak for Somalis, and I make no attempt to do that. But I guess, you know, even it's a small scale study, and I've attempted to sort of document some of the conversations I had. And one of the key things about my book is the conversations we have are really different depending on who we are. So, you know, a Somali woman interacting with me, a white Westerner, you know, but maybe also a parent and also married, you know, we have some things in common, but we also have differences. And so those conversations that we have are products of our similarities and products of our differences. And I found that it was really different the way I accessed men and accessed women, and that fed into those conversations and gave, you know, brought to light different examples of conversations. So for example, women, I spent a lot of time with women, and I got to know several of them quite well. I was invited into women's homes. You know, we sat down, we chatted, we had tea, we had cake, we had, you know, it was a lot of these women I saw regularly. So we kind of built up relationships of trust over a period of time, and the conversations evolved through that relationship. Whereas the men were much more likely to be sort of one-off relationships, or not all of them, but most of them. And also we always met in public. So with men, I tended to meet in cafes or community centres or in sort of public locations. And I think those spaces themselves shaped the conversation and brought to rise different aspects. So, you know, if you're in a public space, you have a stronger sort of notion of the conversation being about public debates, if you like, whereas if you're in a private space, you have a sense that the conversation might be more about sort of intimate personal events and things in your life. So that just the different settings gave rise to different stories. So I guess one of the things the book does do is not try to say, here is the Somali perspective on gender roles, but rather sort of say, here are some different or many different Somali perspectives on gender roles. And, you know, this is the kind of context through which those arise. I hope that sort of answers that question.
Yeah, thanks, Natasha. So there's a question here from Alison. She says, having worked for 15 years with the Somali community as a GP in Camden Market in London, it was women we saw primarily representing the family. I was exposed to their narrative, but what interested me was the difference in resilience between men and women. Do you have any comment on that?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Alison. I think that's quite interesting because that's actually also what brought me into this research in the first place. So as Katharine said, I worked before coming into academia, I worked as an immigration advisor for 10 years. And when I worked 5 years in London, and then I worked 5 years in Bristol. And when I was working in Bristol, many of my clients, perhaps even most of my clients, were of Somali heritage. And many of my clients were women who were trying to bring in husbands. And it quickly became obvious to me that Somalis were refused, you know, men and women were refused more often than not, and much more than my clients of other nationalities. So, you know, Iranians, Iraqis, Pakistanis, you know, clients from all over the globe. And I couldn't quite understand why that was. And I came across some of Katharine Charsley's work on Pakistani migrants to the UK and the significance of the rules and regulations around immigration. And I kind of thought, well, I'd really like to find out more about that. But, you know, so that's really why I ended up doing the PhD in the first place, and why I focused on Somalis, because the idea, as Katharine's work shows, is that Somalis are actually disproportionately get negative decisions for immigration, family decisions, much higher rates than other nationalities. So that is a conundrum, and it's not just straightforwardly about racism. There's a lot of complexity in that. But one of the things I really noticed was the strength and the kind of what you've called resilience, but the incredible sort of pragmatic approach of many of the women who would just come in and say, right, I don't want this man, he's no good, he's useless, he doesn't get out of bed. I do want this man, this one he was, you know, hard worker, they had a kind of a list, and they were very pragmatic about what they wanted from a relationship. And that was something that surprised me, because I think the mainstream discourse in the UK, we're led to believe that Muslim women are subservient and mild and you know, quiet and sort of very much sort of second-class citizens. And that wasn't my experience of Somali women at all. And so that was something that I also wanted to find out more about. So yeah, hope that answers your question.
I wanted to add to that. I was going to say, like, I 100% agree with everything you're saying. Like, I think what is between Somali men and women, especially the generation that came before me, actually migrated to this country themselves, fled from the civil war. A lot of the men feel as if say things with care and like kids and working at a GP, you might find to see more Somali women, because men often than not decide not to get involved and feel as if it's not their role, not their job. They don't think to get involved in that kind of thing. Personally, my dad never came to my GP appointments. My mum always did, and in that sense, I think Somali women are genuinely one of the strongest people that I know. They are very, very independent, and even though they're seen to rely on a man, most cases they really don't, and they fight for themselves and get by on their own amazingly.
Thanks, Huda. Yeah, that's absolutely what I found in the book. Incredible stories from incredible women.
Yeah, and reflected beautifully in the book, I think. So Li Hua says, thank you for the intriguing book and ideas. Could you elaborate more on how the decision to migrate affected the agency of women and their family structure?
Thank you. The decision to migrate affected the agency of women and their family structure. Yeah, so I think that question you're maybe talking about whether if women come first or men come first, that sort of changes the family structure and dynamic. I hope that's right. That's how I'm going to interpret that question. Yes, I think you're probably right, and it does. There is a very well-known book actually called When Women Come First, but the women that were being talked about in that book were women who'd migrated for employment reasons, and so they became the breadwinners on their migration as well. So they were kind of, migrant workers, and that upset the family dynamics. But in this case, a lot of the women who migrated first did so out of the men needing to stay behind in order to fund the journey, and a sense of sort of sending the women and children to safety because of the the refugee context, the war that was going on. Somalis are interesting in immigration statistics in terms of refugees, because they have arrived and claimed asylum in their own right in equal numbers. So it's about 50% male and 50% female in the UK. Whereas the national average is something like 80+% male and less than 20% female. So Somalis do see a much more even split. So a lot of those, from my experience, and both as an immigration caseworker and through doing the PhD and the book, it's not that they are single women necessarily, but they are traveling as single women. They are coming as single women because it's too expensive and too difficult for the family to relocate as a group, and somebody needs to kind of raise the money, which is a long drawn out process, including, for example, selling possessions and things like that. So all of those factors contribute to why women might arrive first. And then does it upset the family dynamic? Yes, I think it does a bit, but in quite a subtle way. So when the woman does arrive first, she's the one who has to find out how things work. She's the one who has to, apply for refugee status, do the discussions with the officials, find how to get benefits, and then if they can get a job, how to get a job, but then also, just things like buses, how to get a bus from A to B, all this kind of very local but really important knowledge. And so then she is teaching the man when he arrives, and that can be quite a struggle. And there's one very nice story in the book about a family who something very similar happened, and they basically he described the 3 years of his marriage in the UK, the first 3 years, as a kind of continuous argument, and it wasn't until they kind of had sorted out what was going wrong and they sat down together and had a good discussion and managed to get their marriage sort of back on track. But that very much that idea of like who had the knowledge and who was the teacher, and that upsetting gender roles. So yeah, thanks for that question.
So a question from Anne-Marie. the stories you share speak of several issues of complex negotiations between settings, status, men-women relationships. I'm curious to hear more. In the middle of so many changes and insecurities, including insecurities about your sense of self, what provided your participants with a sense of security, whether it's their sense of self, masculinity or femininity, or to make it through?
Thank you, Anne-Marie. I think religion would be the first port of call in that, and I see Islam definitely as providing a strong sense of security for many men and women, but particularly women. So women often talk to me precisely about that, how they had refound a sort of sense of self, if you like, a sense of strength in Islam. And that was an Islam which was multicultural often, so not just sort of based on sort of Somali interpretations of Islam, but an Islam that they forged with other Muslims in the UK and through internet sources and through reading the Quran. So a lot of women in particular spoke about how in moments of crisis they turned to the Quran and drew support and strength and inspiration from it. And this was actually quite a difference for many of them, because many of them said if they'd been in Somalia, they wouldn't have consulted the Quran itself. They would have consulted maybe a religious leader or someone respected in the community, or an elder, or their father, for example, you know, someone close to them but important who had religious knowledge. Whereas because of their sort of isolation in this country and the loss of immediate family around them, that drove them to consult the Quran themselves. And through that relationship, you know, reading the Quran, they really transformed their relationship with Islam, and it gave them huge amounts of strength and sense of self and security.
Okay, so now I've got sort of some questions that I think sort of can work together. Josie asks, if you think back to the Natasha who originally planned the PhD, what aspect of the book do you think she'd be most surprised by? Yasha asks what you find hardest to write about and what pained you most to leave out, which I kind of think is a sort of flip side of that question. And are you worried about how your research is received, either by the research subject or the fellow academics?
Well, there's a really, really challenging questions. Josie, I just don't know what the answer to that is. I think I don't know. I think I was quite prepared to be, you know, my approach to research was very much to go along with where I was led. So I was less surprised than, I don't think I was particularly surprised in the sense that I didn't have strong expectations, or, you know, I didn't sort of stick to my, like, this is what I want to know, when, you know, because I started out with this, what's happening with the immigration rules. That was the sort of the research question going into the research. But very quickly, you know, I had on my research sheet, my information sheet, I had this sentence that started with, like, this research is about Somali marriage, and very quickly participants started talking about divorce. And so I kind of followed that lead, and yeah, that's probably about all I can say on that. Yasha, there's a whole chapter that had to be cut out and I'm trying to work on it now to reshape it and put it into an article, and it's on love, actually. And yeah, so I did sort of pain and struggle with leaving that out, because it felt to me like it really should be in the book, but at the same time something had to go. I had a word limit from the publishers, and I needed the space of the other words to make the whole thing as a narrative make sense. So that was the bit that had to go, but I do definitely want to write about that somewhere else. So that was stories of how people got together, stories of love and stories of not love. And I guess actually going back to Josie's question, that was also what surprised me quite a lot, about how people could be very emotional, but also very pragmatic, and perhaps, you know, more honest with themselves than the average Westerner, who sort of has this idealized discourse of love and downplays the sort of pragmatic aspects that nonetheless are really important. I'm talking sort of economics and that kind of stuff. And I think the stories I heard from Somalis were a lot more honest to themselves about what was important in a good marriage, and emotion was, you know, absolutely a part of that, but they were alert to other factors also being very important. And in terms of, am I worried about how my research is going to be received? Yes, of course. My first worry is always about my participants, and, you know, I think every one of us will always, you know, academics always think, oh, are they going to like it? Yes, that is always a struggle, and I don't have a definitive answer how to address that, but yes, I do worry.
And then there's a question from Fuzia. I'm interested to know what community mechanisms, if any, did the women consult upon relationship breakdown?
Thank you. That's a great question. Yeah, so not many, to be honest, and that was a change as well. So people did talk to me about consulting community mechanisms, and some had been through that process, but the women in particular were not happy with how those processes worked. So women described how embarrassing it was to talk to a group of older men about what was going wrong in your relationship. You know, as this sense of shame in sort of airing your dirty laundry in public. That's a very British expression, but, you know, sort of letting other people know what's going wrong with your marriage, a strong sense of shame, and also a sense that the community elders were usually male and might therefore just say, okay, just get on with it, you know, woman needs to know her place, you know, she should just we'll talk to the man, but then the women knowing that not much would change despite the fact that he would be talked to. And so many of them forged their own mechanisms as a result of that. So they took different strategies. Some just didn't tell family when things were going wrong, and they just made that decision, and they said, if I tell them, they'll just tell me I have to stay in the marriage, so therefore I'm not going to tell them. And I only told them after I'd left, so when it was all complete and they couldn't do anything about it. Others talked about going through the process of community mediation processes, and, you know, not really getting much out of it. But then there's also another story I heard from a man who was actually one of the mediators in such a relationship breakdown, and he was very much talking about how, in his opinion, the woman in that situation had got it right, and he was supportive of her point of view. So yeah, I hope that answers the question there.
So just picking up on the, so you mentioned divorce. So there is a question from Annika, who says, congratulations from Denmark. Studies from Denmark show that Somalians divorce a lot more than people from, for example, Pakistan, Turkey and Iraq. I heard of Somali women mentioning the following proverb: rather divorce 30 times than live in an unhappy marriage. Did you hear of similar sayings during your fieldwork or in your proverb book?
Definitely not in the proverb book. I think that was steered towards the men rather than the women. But there was somebody else's research with Somali women and men in London had recorded a very similar story. Yeah, there was definitely a sense amongst Somalis in Bristol that divorce rates were high, too high, and that this was a sort of product of migration. There's no data available in the UK, so we have no way of knowing whether that is the case or not. But the participants explained divorce. They saw it as an increase, and they just explained that as a result of migration. But having said that, that was very much the public facing. So when you're first sort of answer when you said, so, you know, if you ask people why are people divorcing, they'd say, oh, well, it's because of capturing, it's because of the refugee experience, it's because of this, you know, they'd have these very set narratives. But when I asked people who had divorced, and many of my participants had, none of them brought up those public facing reasons at all. And they were all very personal accounts. A lot of them related to men taking second wives in Somalia. And they were all very emotional accounts too. So the public facing stories kind of denied emotion, and they denied any relevance of Somalia today or visits back home or anything like that. They just had these two kind of stock narratives, one about capturing for the men and the other one about women being too free in the West. But the private stories, you know, really didn't, they kind of engaged with those public stories a bit, but most of them were actually about men going back to visit Somalia and coming back with it, having married for a second time without having asked the wife first or done any of the steps that were meant to be taken within an Islamic context. And that was seen as a betrayal, you know, by the women. They absolutely saw that as a betrayal of their relationship. And others were just due to, you know, differing expectations, people not getting on, like Hibak was saying, people had different expectations of what would make a good marriage. So yeah, the public stories and the private stories didn't match happily. Yeah, thanks.
There's a couple of questions about generations that I'll put together because I'm just also conscious of the time. So Mano asks about, you know, you talk about a loss of ontological security. Did the women talk about this in relation to their relationship with their children? For example, if parent-child roles were reversed, as refugee children have talked about, you know, how parents had to depend on them because of language skills. Did this challenge traditional parent-child roles? And then that's kind of also, I think, linked to Ali's question, where he asked whether you've looked into or noticed any generational differences among Somali immigrant community.
Yeah, and Huda might like to come in on this as well. But yeah, I think there is definitely an important dimension there. But I think my research only kind of touches on it, and this is an area which needs a lot more exploration in its own right, the kind of parent-child refugee sort of scenario in the new location. And the reason I'm saying that is because I think it's more complicated than just the child taking on a kind of parent role. I think it's much also, you know, other factors are really important, like the loss of community parenting, which was something participants really spoke about a lot. So they would say, for example, that in Somalia, you would tell off any child you saw on the street who was doing something wrong. So if you saw a child who was doing anything wrong at all, you'd tell them off and you'd find out who they were, and then you'd go and tell their parent, you know, what they'd done, and you told them off, and your parent would say, oh, thanks, you know, that's great, tell them off, you know. Whereas when they tried to do that in the UK, the child didn't listen to them and just said, well, who are you, you know? And if they knew who the parent wasn't thankful. The other parent was like, how dare you tell my child off, you know? So that they saw as a really big transformation, and in a sense, the nuclear sort of setup of the family with its mechanisms for disciplining hadn't stepped up, if you like. So there was a loss of community parenting, but nothing had really filled its place. And that had led to a generation of boys, particularly, who were perceived to be losing their way, if you like, in society and in the world. And a lot of participants spoke very movingly about this perception of a loss of way, particularly among Somali boys. And that, in fact, led me to the basis of my postdoc, which I haven't written about yet, but I will do one day, which is to exactly explore those kind of generational differences, particularly between mothers and sons. So when I've had the chance to write that up, I'll let you know.
Oh, well, we look forward to that. Huda, do you have any response to that? Do you have any thoughts on this generation?
I found that really interesting to listen to, because my whole life I thought a daughter, especially a firstborn daughter, had to take on the role as a mother as well, especially if you had little siblings. I personally don't, so I haven't experienced it firsthand, but I've seen my friends they have to take care of their younger siblings, have to clean, have to cook. And I think it's a thing where a lot of mothers had experienced that back home in Somalia. They had experienced that, where they gave their mother a break and kind of took over for them, especially because they might have not had any other responsibilities, might have dropped out of school to do so. Nowadays, back in Somalia, a lot of girls are actually pursuing an education, actually going to uni and finishing that, which is an amazing thing. But they still have to uphold that responsibility at home, which I think a lot of girls, especially in the UK, have to deal with. I also kind of wanted to ask more, kind of confirm, so about sons and like them losing their way, is that because they are seeing other things as more important, or they are kind of getting into a bad kind of life? Or
I think a lot of it was to do with the fact that the community disciplining structure wasn't there. And, you know, boys are, like you say, girls are often expected and asked to stay at home to help with sort of duties there, whereas boys are expected to have a sort of public role. And if you don't have community discipline outside the home, then that public role isn't regulated, it isn't disciplined or you know, held in check in any way. And so those boys were very easily getting into situations which or sort of with other people who weren't particularly desirable, or perhaps, you know, were involved in drugs or whatever, that kind of thing. But yeah, like I say, that's the next book.
Yeah, I 100% agree. That is a huge problem. And I think that difference in kind of roles and responsibilities between women and men and boys and girls, especially my generation, I think, I'm not going to lie, I think my generation, they do acknowledge these differences and they do acknowledge these gender roles, but they don't like to address it as much. They do address it. Boys especially, they benefit from it, so they don't see it as anything worth addressing. I also kind of wanted to touch back on, if it's okay, we were talking about kind of divorce. I think that's a huge, it happens everywhere and people are so silent about it. To this, like, we're in 2021 and it's such a taboo. Last year on Twitter, a lot of Somali girls were speaking up about their experiences within the Somali community with sexual assault and like harassment. And what shocked me is that a few of them spoke on their mother getting remarried and them being taken advantage of in that sense, and then another divorce had occurred. It was actually really interesting reading, and it's really heartbreaking as well why girls have to experience these things and why divorce in this sense is seen as such a problem, but we're not addressing it and we're not tackling it and making it so that future generations don't have to deal with this this terror. Like, you're going through all of this, say if you were sexually assaulted or harassed by one of these figures in your life, and you have to stay silent about it because it's taboo, you can't speak out. These girls were anonymous on Twitter as well. I think that's very interesting, and that it kind of links into how divorce is not, it is shied away from hugely.
Thanks.
Yeah,
perhaps that leads us to The Generations, a poem,
Yeah.
last poem by Kaltun.
Maybe we could, so that's a really important point, Huda, and I think it kind of shows that we could have like a much bigger conversation. But unfortunately, we are gonna, and there's still questions coming in, and I'm really sorry that we didn't manage to answer all of them, but unfortunately we are going to have to close the session after the after Kaltun's poem. But just to say, if you do keep an eye on the MMB website for our activities, do sign up for our newsletter so that you can come along to more events like this. But can I ask Emily to put up Kaltun's last poem and thank all of our participants, Katharine, Huda, and of course, Natasha. And thank you for your fantastic book, Natasha, and thank you everyone for coming.
Thank you, everyone.
But what is different? Grandmother, mother I see. Silk cloths of intricate designs, poems and prose rich in rhyme, each referring to a time. In a place unlike here, distant, foreign, alien, but home you hear. Grandmother, mother I see, that between you and me the same home, but what is different is times known. We are in the same roof on walls, but reminisce different youthful thoughts. Grandmother, mother I see. We don't ever try to understand each other, but really command without comprehension that our memories overlap, but will never map perfectly with each other.